If there's one thing Celeste does better than almost any other game, it's not the difficulty, it's tolerance. The game constantly stress tests your abilities, asking how much you're willing to go through before it stops feeling worthwhile. The easiest way I can explain the experience of Celeste, without spoiling it, is to compare it to spicy food. It's a game that is unapologetically built around challenge, and if you're not open to being pushed, it's going to feel uncomfortable. Kind of like ordering the hottest thing on the menu when you've never built any tolerance for heat. So if you were like me and had heard about Celeste for years but never tried it, I'd recommend playing it yourself before watching the rest of this video. But only if you enjoy 2D platformers or games that demand high mechanical skill, or in other words, games that require pressing buttons really fast. Celeste does a good job of teaching you how to get better, and I think most players could finish most of it, but if that kind of mechanical challenge isn't something you enjoy, the experience is more likely to feel frustrating than rewarding. Celeste is about climbing a mountain, but this video isn't about whether climbing a mountain is hard, that part's obvious. It's about how far up that mountain you're willing and able to go, and where it actually makes sense to stop. What Celeste forced me to confront was how endless the escalation can become once difficulty turns into a dick measuring contest. This isn't a mountain with a single objective summit, it's a layered experience, where the only meaningful endpoint is the one you set for yourself. It shouldn't need to be said, but as I had to remind myself constantly of while playing, finishing every level, finding all collectibles, earning every achievement, doing every golden strawberry, or even beating the game deathless twice, does not make your playthrough more valid as an experience. It can make you more skilled, sometimes to a ridiculous degree, and in some cases more qualified to speak about specific mechanics, but at the end of the day, that's all it is, not to be confused with a measure of personal worth. I'm going to break Celeste down piece by piece because it genuinely deserves the praise it's received since launching in 2018, but I also have real criticisms of it, and I know that can be uncomfortable given how passionate this fanbase is. So if there's one thing I'd ask in return, just like how Celeste asks you to be open to difficult rooms and repeated failure, it's to be open to hearing things that might be a little harder to sit with. Alright, now all that stuff's out of the way, how do we actually climb this mountain? Chapter 1. Climbing. Celeste's gameplay is built around guiding Madeline through a series of compact rooms, each packed with obstacles and hazards. Every chapter introduces its own recurring mechanics, and those mechanics are slowly expanded upon as you move from room to room. One room might teach you that a specific block moves along a fixed path when you touch it. A few rooms later, the game builds on that idea by showing you that you can transfer that block's momentum to Madeline if you time your jump correctly. This gradual layering of small, teachable mechanics is at the heart of Celeste's progression. There's no external experience bar or skill tree telling you how far you've come. Progress is measured almost entirely by your internal understanding of the systems, and by how much control you have over your character. And that sense of control is where Celeste really earns its reception. At a glance, Madeline's toolset is simple. You can jump, dash, and climb. But each of these individual tools has a surprising amount of depth. Your jump height depends on how long you hold the input. Climbing is governed by a stamina system that you constantly have to manage, and later on it becomes the way you grab, hold, and manipulate objects in the environment. And the dash, while simple on paper, has dozens of applications, many of which aren't even properly introduced until the final stretch of the game. Even at a basic level, dashing can be used to cancel momentum, extend airtime, or travel precise, consistent distances in rooms that demand tight execution. But beyond these more obvious tools, the most important one you have is your directional control, often referred to as DI, short for directional influence. The term comes from games like Super Smash Bros., but here it simply means how much influence you have over Madeline's movement. In Celeste, you can move in 8 directions, both on the ground and in the air. While plenty of games allow this, Celeste places a huge emphasis on aerial control, often pushing you into situations that feel uncomfortable or unintuitive at first. Sometimes the correct solution is to barely move at all. Other times it's about weaving through corners of hazards with little room for error, which leads into how the game's rooms are actually structured. The way I see it, Every room in Celeste is built from two main components: the puzzle and the execution. These aren't traditional puzzles in the sense of something like The Witness. They're much more open-ended because there are often multiple valid ways to approach a room depending on your understanding of the mechanics. Still, the process is the same. You read the room, figure out which tools you need, and decide on the sequence required to reach the end. Some rooms lean heavily toward problem solving, while others strip the puzzle away entirely and ask for near-perfect execution of an obvious solution. But this balance between puzzle and execution, this push and pull between understanding and precision, is really the meat and potatoes of Celeste. And all of that gameplay sits alongside beautifully realized levels, packed with clear visual and auditory feedback from every block, hazard, and interaction. And then there's the iconic soundtrack, which does an incredible job of shaping the atmosphere of each distinct area. It slows things down in the more methodical sections, and then ramps everything up during the intense, flashy chase sequences that are designed to flood you with energy. Honestly, Celeste's presentation feels close to perfect. I can't think of a single interface element, sound effect, track, or visual choice that I'd want to change. I don't have much critique here, because from this angle the game is simply exceptional. It might not offer the jaw-dropping vistas of something like Elden Ring, but for a game of this scale, I genuinely don't think I've seen anything do it better. Alongside that presentation is an incredibly wholesome story that works on two distinct levels. On the surface, it's about a young woman learning how to deal with her own personal struggles. A lot of it is intentionally vague, which makes it easy for many players to see parts of themselves in Madeline. Some of the writing can be a little on the nose for my taste, but it never once undermined the experience. The story stays small in scope, doesn't take itself too seriously, and carries a charm and sincerity that's hard not to enjoy. But on a deeper level, the story is also about the act of reaching the summit, not just for Madeline, but for us as players. And that alignment between character motivation and player motivation is surprisingly rare in video games. More often than not, the two are at odds. Fallout 4 is a notorious example, where the protagonist's urgent search for their son clashes with the player's desire to explore the open world. Other times, the protagonist has almost no motivation at all, serving as a blank slate for the player to project onto. Celeste avoids both of these. Madeline wants to reach the summit, and so do you. Because of that, every story beat carries more weight. The struggle on screen mirrors the struggle in your hands, and that synchronicity gives the journey a kind of emotional grounding that very few games manage to pull off. Everything I've talked about so far fits neatly into the praise Celeste usually gets, and I agree with most of it. But this is where the idea of tolerance actually starts to matter, where the game begins asking not just, can you do this, but should you? And the best place to start is with strawberries. Chapter 2. Altitude. For anyone who hasn't played Celeste, strawberries are the game's primary optional collectible. There are two broad types: secret strawberries, which reward exploration and curiosity, and challenge strawberries, which ask for more precise execution or a deeper understanding of the mechanics. That being said, none of them are required to reach the game's first ending, but calling strawberries optional doesn't really capture how they function in practice. I'd wager everyone who has played Celeste collects at least some of them, not because the game pressures you with rewards or progression locks, but because of how naturally they're presented along the main path. That's especially true of challenge strawberries, and this is where the idea of tolerance really begins. Most challenge strawberries aren't hidden away or isolated in bonus rooms. They're small detours inside spaces you were already going to traverse. A strawberry floats just slightly out of reach, asking you to take a risk, try a tighter movement, or experiment with your tools in a way the main path doesn't strictly require. Saying no is always allowed, but saying yes is almost the whole point of the game. And when you do say yes, something important happens. Each challenge strawberry quietly nudges you into becoming more comfortable with Celeste's controls. You learn how far a dash really carries you, how much momentum you can conserve, how precise your timing actually needs to be, and how important your DI is. In other words, the game makes you better, not through obligation, but through invitation. These challenges escalate as the game goes on, but that escalation is matched by the player's growing tolerance for difficulty. Early strawberries ask for small risks. Later ones demand far more confidence and consistency. What once felt intimidating starts to feel achievable, not because the game got easier, but because you changed. Bringing it back to the spicy food analogy, tolerance works the same way here. If you've been exposed to heat, over time higher levels stop feeling overwhelming. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable, sometimes even enjoyable. And a lot of that change doesn't come from natural ability, but from repeated intentional exposure. You can see this progression clearly in the first few challenge strawberries the game introduces. Early on they tend to ask for very small commitments. A strawberry floats in a dangerous spot, forcing you to time a single movement correctly. The risk is obvious, the solution is readable, and failure costs almost nothing. Though a few rooms later, the game raises the stakes slightly. Instead of testing timing, it asks you to commit to your movement. You can't rely on quick corrections anymore. You have to trust your jumps and spacing. These are still modest challenges compared to what comes later, but they quietly shift what the game expects you to be confident in doing. By the time you reach a more demanding challenge strawberry later on, one that asks you to traverse an entire room surrounded by spikes all the way down and then back up again, the escalation is clear. The game now expects you to chain multiple skills together without hesitation. What would have felt overwhelming earlier on now feels achievable. Not because it's objectively easy, but because your tolerance has grown alongside the challenge. And this isn't even the halfway point. Celeste, in its final stages, introduces some truly challenging rooms, ones that ask for near-perfect execution, but by then they no longer feel out of place. At that point, they feel like a natural extension of everything the game has already taught you to endure. Challenge strawberries integrate cleanly with Celeste's core loop. They reward risk, build confidence, and deepen your engagement with the game's mechanics. Secret strawberries ask for something very different, and in doing so, they start to strain the system Celeste has otherwise been so careful to build. From the very start of the game, Celeste is littered with hidden rooms, false walls, and secret passages that can only be found by careful observation, or by physically testing the edges of the level. Instead of asking you to execute a difficult sequence, these strawberries ask for constant vigilance. On paper that wouldn't be a problem. If you could cleanly opt out of secret strawberries, the solution would be simple. Don't look for them. But Celeste doesn't separate its optional content that neatly. Hidden behind many of these false walls are full challenge rooms, the very kind of content the game otherwise excels at. And that overlap is where things start to break down. Once you know secret rooms exist, every room becomes suspect. Every wall might be lying to you. Instead of engaging with the platforming, the flow, or the visual design, you're incentivized to stop and interrogate the space, to scan walls and second-guess forward momentum. The result is a warped pacing. You either slow the game to a crawl, turning Celeste more into a game about checking walls than actual platforming, or you push forward and risk missing some of its best challenge content. Either way, the clean rhythm the game works so hard to build gets disrupted. For players who enjoy slow, methodical exploration, this approach will likely feel rewarding rather than disruptive. In that context, the two systems can sit comfortably alongside each other, and Celeste may even feel stronger because of it. For me though, that shift in focus clashed with the way the rest of the game had taught me to have fun, and that clash is where the pacing started to unravel. But this tension doesn't stop here. As Celeste pushes higher, the demand it places on your attention and endurance only intensify. Chapter 3. The B side of the mountain. Burnout is a word I'd use to describe my experience with Celeste, but usually in common parlance, this is just shorthand for dissatisfaction. I felt burnt out playing Celeste's B-sides, but not because they were too hard. The burnout came from how that difficulty was structured, and what the game stopped giving me in return for enduring it. For anyone who hasn't played them, B-sides are alternate versions of Celeste's main chapters, unlocked by finding cassette tapes hidden throughout the A-sides. Structurally, they mirror the levels you've already completed, but almost everything else is stripped away. There's no story progression, very little teaching, and far less variation in pacing. What remains is a long sequence of rooms designed almost exclusively to test execution. Technically speaking, B-sides are shorter than their A-side counterparts, but in practice they feel much longer. Each individual room is significantly harder than anything you encountered in the main game. And because that difficulty is sustained without interruption, the experience stretches out. You're no longer moving between easy rooms, teaching moments, and harder tests. It's challenge after challenge, back to back across entire chapters. That lack of relief matters more than it might sound. In the A-sides, difficulty is balanced by moments of rest, easier rooms, narrative beats, or sections that exist primarily to introduce new ideas. Those breaks don't just give your hands a rest, they reset your attention. The B-sides largely remove that rhythm. What you're left with is a continuous demand for precision with nothing to punctuate it. If that demand was consistently paired with learning, it might have held up. But by the time you reach the B-sides, most of Celeste's core mechanics have already been introduced. While there's occasionally a new trick or two per chapter, the majority of rooms are variations on concepts you already understand. The difference isn't what you're being asked to do, it's how unforgiving the margin of error becomes. So the problem isn't just that B-sides are difficult, it's that they ask you to tolerate a sustained level of intensity without offering much in return. No meaningful expansion of your understanding, no change in pace, and no space to breathe. Across roughly 20 rooms per chapter, over multiple chapters, that imbalance starts to weigh you down. I completed all of the B-sides, but by the end of them, that carefully built sense of tolerance, the one the main game cultivated so well, had started to erode. What once felt like growth began to feel like endurance for its own sake. The B-sides feel like eating spicy food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Not because each bite is unbearable, but because there's no relief. Your tolerance might improve, but the experience stops being about flavor and starts being about suffering. Unfortunately, none of this is optional if you want to keep going. I've avoided talking about Chapter 8 until now, but this is where a lot of the frustration I've been describing finally comes to a head. To even access it, you're required to collect crystal hearts hidden throughout earlier chapters, many of them tucked behind obscure puzzles or false walls that practically encourage the use of third-party guides. After the cumulative fatigue of the B-sides, being asked to backtrack and hunt for secrets felt less like a challenge and more like another layer of attrition. Chapter 8 does introduce new mechanics, and on paper that sounds like exactly what the game needs at this point, but it comes at a cost. Most of Celeste's obstacles, easily 95% of them, are excellent. They're readable, consistent, and reward skillful traversal. The problem is that a small handful of mechanics break from that clarity, and those mechanics are heavily concentrated in Chapter 8. I'm going to use the word randomness loosely, because it's not literal RNG, it's something closer to blurriness. Celeste often uses moving hazards with repeating cycles, like the dust bunnies introduced back in Chapter 3. Most of these move slowly and predictably enough that with enough understanding and execution, you can reasonably expect to pass through them consistently. But even early on, there are exceptions. Cycles that move so quickly that success feels less like mastery and more like repeated trial and error. You run it enough times and eventually you get through unscathed. Chapter 8 leans hard into that kind of design. Rooms stack fast-moving death zones back to back, and when you hit them after the B-sides, that lingering frustration can turn into outright anger. But worse than that are mechanics that feel fundamentally unclear in how they're meant to be read. Clouds and conveyor belts are the clearest examples. Clouds act like trampolines, launching Madeline upward depending on the timing of your jump. The idea behind this is sound. Celeste has trained you to respect precise timing, but in practice, to reach the peak height of the jump, the timing window is too tight or very poorly communicated. Even after completing every level in the game, I couldn't reliably explain what I was doing differently on a successful attempt versus a failed one. Conveyor belts in Chapter 8 work similarly. They carry you up a wall, and if you jump at the exact right moment, you're launched up with enough momentum to clear the next obstacle. That launch is required repeatedly, and yet the rules governing it never fully clicked for me. I did get more consistent over time through sheer muscle memory, but that consistency didn't come from understanding the system so much as enduring it. And this is where the idea of a skill issue comes into play. I want to elaborate though. The issue isn't that Chapter 8 demands skill, it clearly does. It's that it demands a different kind of skill than the rest of Celeste has spent hours cultivating. Up to this point, the game asks you to tolerate difficulty you can pass, practice, and eventually master with its rules clearly on display. Here it asks you to tolerate difficulty you can't fully explain, only repeat. When the contract shifts like that, it stops feeling like growth and starts feeling like throwing yourself at the wall until something sticks. But thankfully, this is also where the worst of the game finally ends. After pushing through Chapter 8b, the Seasides unlock, and for me, they were exactly the course correction Celeste needed. Most Seasides are built the same way. There are only 3 rooms. The first 2 introduce or recontextualize ideas you already understand, and the third is a long brutal gauntlet that demands near perfect execution. There are a few massive differences that make Seasides work when compared to their B-side counterparts. Where the B-sides sit at a steady, exhausting level of difficulty, the Seasides spike it dramatically. The challenge room in a Seaside feels harder than anything the B-sides ask of you. In a sense, it is just tighter margins, but the jump is so large and so deliberate that it feels fresh. That magnitude is what makes the difficulty feel engaging again. The game isn't asking you to endure a long stretch of pretty hard rooms, it's asking you to solve something genuinely extreme, and then letting you move on. This is where the food analogy finally clicks for me. Eating mildly spicy food over and over again isn't impressive, it's just tiring. But eating something extremely spicy once in a controlled setting is memorable. The intensity is higher, but the experience is more distinct and novel. The Seasides work for the same reason. But it's not just the spike in difficulty that makes the Seasides work. It's how that difficulty is set up. The structure itself fixes the problems the B-sides introduced. Where the B-sides ask you to slog through long stretches of similarly demanding rooms, the Seasides deliberately break that pressure up. The first 2 rooms act as breathing space, not because they're easy, but because they introduce new information and give you time to understand what's being asked of you. That respite doesn't weaken the challenge, it elevates it. By the time you reach the final room, you're not going through the motions, you're primed for the challenge. And crucially, the game is still teaching you something new. Even this late into the experience, Celeste finds ways to recontextualize mechanics you thought you'd already mastered. That constant trickle of new ideas is what kept me engaged, even as I died over and over again in those final rooms. The difficulty was extreme, but it felt purposeful, like I was learning and applying something new, not just grinding execution for its own sake. We now reach 8C, the final Seaside in the game, and the second to last level overall. But it's a chapter I'm deeply conflicted on. On the one hand, some of the sequences here are genuinely exhilarating, pushing Celeste to some of its most demanding and rewarding moments yet. On the other, it introduces ideas that are far too important to be handled as abruptly as they are. This is where the game formally introduces wave dashing, a precise sequence of inputs that allows you to preserve dash momentum through a jump, dramatically extending how far and how fast Madeline can move. Alongside it is wall bouncing, a related technique first hinted at earlier, but never fully explored until much later. Together, these 2 mechanics fundamentally change how you understand movement in Celeste. They aren't just harder tricks, though they are, they also expand what the character is capable of in a way that redefines the ceiling of play. The problem then is that 8C doesn't really give these ideas the space they deserve. Mechanics this transformative and precise need time to breathe, room to fail, room to experiment, and to understand why something works when it works. Instead, they're introduced quickly and expected to be executed almost immediately. A brief prompt telling you what buttons to press isn't enough to build a real foundation, and it's easy to stumble through these sections by brute force trial and error rather than comprehension. And yet, even through that frustration, 8C still succeeds in one crucial way. It shows you what's coming. It plants the idea that Celeste isn't done asking more of you, that everything you've learned so far was preparation for something even higher. Because once 8C is complete, the final chapter unlocks, and this time, the game gives these ideas the space they've been waiting for. Chapter 4. Farewell. Remember that whole idea of tolerance? In a strange way, Farewell made me realize that Celeste had been training me for this moment the entire time, almost like the whole game was a layered tutorial leading to this chapter. Yes, Farewell is long. Longer than I'd prefer, but by this point maybe that's the point. The stamina I built through the B-sides finally has a purpose. My ability to pass new mechanics quickly, to understand rooms faster, and to control Madeline with confidence didn't come from nowhere. It was built slowly from the very first Strawberry onward. The opening stretch of Farewell reflects that. You move through the first half with relatively little resistance. You'll still die, maybe a lot, but death no longer carries the same weight. The ability to struggle, reset, and move forward is a skill you've been developing since the start of the game. Difficulty no longer feels like a wall, it feels like a conversation. And then you reach Event Horizon. This is where everything comes to a head. This is where Celeste finally asks whether all that tolerance it's been building was enough. This is also where the game properly commits to its highest level movement mechanics, wave dashing and wall bouncing, and, for the first time, truly weaves them into the fabric of the experience. When I first saw these rooms, I was intimidated. I vaguely understood how these techniques worked, but now I was being asked to use them reliably back to back and under pressure. They felt like speedrunning tech, something I assumed lived far outside my ability. It genuinely felt like I wasn't good enough to finish the chapter. But after grinding those rooms for about half an hour, with the help of an external guide since the in-game one kept crashing, something clicked. The input sequence finally made sense. I wasn't consistent yet, not even close, but I understood what made a wave dash work. I understood how to wall bounce reliably, and that understanding changed everything. Up until this point, most new mechanics in Celeste interacted with the environment. Platforms, hazards, objects. Wave dashing and wall bouncing are different. They fundamentally change you. They redefine how Madeline moves and by extension, how you think about space, distance, and possibility within every room in the game. That's why these mechanics would have been overwhelming at the start. If Celeste had asked this of me early on, I don't think I would have felt capable of continuing. It's like being served a dish so spicy you wouldn't even attempt a bite. You need your palate built first. And that build-up, that slow, intentional expansion of what you believe you can do, is Celeste's greatest achievement. From there, the final stretch of Farewell becomes something special. It turns into a sandbox for your new tools. The rooms are demanding, often brutally so, requiring multiple precise wave dashes and wall bounces chained together in ways that would have seemed impossible hours earlier. But the fear is gone now. You've done harder things, you know you can do this. The presentation and story that added so much but had been missing for so long finally return. Each room has a breathtaking sense of beauty and importance. This feels like a reward, not for raw skill, but for everything you've endured and learned along the way. The chapter culminates in a final gauntlet, a long, deathless sequence that functions like a seaside distilled into a single room. It asks you to apply everything you've learned, and in doing so, it makes your mastery tangible. At first, you move cautiously, feeling out each section, but as your confidence grows, you start pushing forward faster, not because you're reckless, but because you understand the space. That sense of growth becomes addictive, and when you finally reach the end, the game isn't quite done with you. There's one last secret, the Moonberry, hidden behind another set of difficult rooms. I suspect most players who make it this far go back for it. I did. Climbing through those final rooms, watching the end draw closer and closer felt like standing at the summit I'd been aiming for the entire time. That was my peak. That was where my journey with Celeste ended. I could have kept climbing. I could have chased golden strawberries for deathless runs, or gave speedrunning a go. But for me, those challenges would have only diminished what was already a perfect ending. I stopped where it felt right. Not because I couldn't go further, but because I didn't need to. That was my summit. Different people want different things from their video games, and because of that, some people will probably look at where I chose to stop and see it as weak. Honestly, I feel that a little bit myself. But once you start going down that road, it becomes arbitrary really quickly. Why stop there? Why not collect every strawberry? And if that's the benchmark, why not speedrun the game to give my opinions even more weight? And even that might not be enough. Why not go for the world record while we're at it? That line of thinking never really ends. The other reason I stopped where I did comes back to how Celeste made me feel while playing it. This whole idea of tolerance and the relationship the game builds around it. To me, Celeste isn't designed around the idea of never failing. Dying is part of the experience. In fact, the game actively teaches you to tolerate failure. Why else would it give you instant respawns, generous checkpoints, and infinite lives? That's not to say deathless runs aren't impressive, they absolutely are. They're clearly possible, I'm just not good enough to pull them off at the moment. And yeah, that's a skill issue. But it's also not the kind of experience I was personally chasing by the end. If you stopped at the A-sides, never touched the B-sides or Farewell, and still walked away feeling like you got something meaningful out of Celeste, more importantly, if you had fun, then you played it the right way. And if you're someone who's collected every golden strawberry or speedruns this game for fun, all power to you. You're way better at this game than I am, and probably a bit of a masochist, but genuinely, nothing but respect. As much as Celeste taught me how to tolerate hardship and push through difficulty, it also left me satisfied enough to set a boundary for myself. It taught me when to keep climbing and when it was okay to stop. Celeste is a wholesome, difficult, and deeply considered game that I think a lot of people can get something out of, with the caveat that it gets pretty spicy at times. You just have to be open to that if you want to fully appreciate it. But yeah, that's all from me. Peace and love.